Hello, everybody. Thank you and welcome to this hour and a half session on the convergence between agriculture and climate. It's a learning as we go session. We're a bit humbled by the opportunity to be witness to what's going on at the convergence of agriculture and climate. And in this presentation, I hope to share with you the learnings that we've had that you might then be able to take back and put into practice within your context. And that could be as an NRM, it could be as an ag tech, it could be as a cooperative advisor, it could be as a cooperative yourself. We've got quite a diverse audience in today. What I thought we would try and go through, though, logically, and what you guys responded to in the advertisement is, look at the convergence, look at the lingo and what matters here, how that affects supply chains, how that then feeds into what farmers can do collectively, and how that works ultimately towards helping regenerative farmers around Australia. So with your permission, I'll just give you a bit of background about Regen Farmers Mutual. We opened up for members about 12 months ago, and since then we've had about 100 members join. We've actually had to restrict membership, based on the capacity of having enough regen advisors to service them. However, the general momentum that Regen Farmers Mutual has experienced is like nothing I've experienced across cooperative startups and 25 years in sort of entrepreneurial activities. Part of the reason for that sort of momentum is that we've got a unique proposition in the market in that our farmers are our members and we are there to help them with the infrastructure to represent themselves in a changing market. And I guess what we've come to understand is that we're the farmers' trusted partner as they start to identify opportunities and, prove that they're happening on the ground and being able to monetize those. But it's not all like success. I spend a lot of my day speaking to disgruntled farmers who are looking at what they see as the environmental and climate markets, which is the very loud carbon market. And the sort of feedback that we hear from farmers, really reputable ones, is that this whole thing is a scam and it's not practical and it doesn't look like it's been, fairly set up. You get kind of pinned for your emissions straight away, but nothing of what you've done that's good in the past counts. And, any of the processes are highly technical and have upfront costs, and it just takes years to yield accus. So it's almost like the farmer hasn't been considered in the creation of carbon markets. But the big thing in the carbon markets, and we had an accountant describe this to us, is this is the biggest thing that's happened in accounting since the invention of accounting, is these Scope 3 emissions. So Scope 3 emissions refer to the carbon footprint of human impact. But as farmers, we have far more impact than just on climate change or on the atmospheric carbon levels. Our impacts across nitrogen, phosphorus, and biodiversity can be directly related to the ways in which we practice agriculture and practice land use. And so on a whole, our agriculture and the food system is playing a role, and it's polluting, it's exploiting, and it's exceeding our barriers, and we're changing the world in which we live in. And to kind of understand how we're affecting climate, we, created a carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e. And we've now decided that the carbon emissions related with everything that we burn for energy, that we build, whether it's local manufacturing or in really high intense manufacturing, and anything that we transport, it emits. And we're going to report on those emissions as they affect climate from 2024. And the way that the emissions look like when you start to report them is that banks have decided that the emissions, their Scope 3 emissions, include the emissions of all of their customers. And supply chain organizations, large organizations, have included in their scope 3 emissions the emissions intensity of their supply sheds. So that is the sum of all of the farmers who supply to them. Government has a vested interest in seeing farmer emissions come down because we've legislated that within 60 months, we're going to bring down carbon by 43% on 2005 levels and be net zero by 2050. And industry brokers, brokers, everybody is interested in carbon and farmers' emissions. Now, when I say everybody, I literally mean what you're looking at on screen at the moment is from the Cool Farm Alliance. There's 300 organizations in there. You can see little Regen Farmers Mutual's got our logo up there, but some of these organizations, Kellogg's, Mars, McDonald's, Simplot, these are gorillas in the supply chain space, in our food systems, and they are now going to be reporting on the emissions of all of their constituent suppliers. So what does this mean? It means that you will be paid not only for what you produce, your wheat, your wool, your beef, but also how you produce it. Now, for wholesale or supply chain sellers of conventional agricultural products, this might be new, but it's not new in terms of markets. Organic farmers have been getting paid for what they produce and how they produce it. Direct consumer, like meat supply boxes or Farmers Direct or Food Connect, have been getting paid for what they produce and how it's produced. And even when you come down to individual commodities like eggs, free range versus barn laid, is a question of getting paid not just for the egg, but how that egg is produced. And you can tell that, this will be a step change for agriculture on the whole. We're used to, as farmers, a really tactile and fairly sensible business model of you grow a ton of wheat or wool or beef or whatever, and then you sell a ton of wheat or wool or beef, and then you get paid for that ton of wheat or wool or beef. But now, going forward with mandatory reporting, you're going to see the conventional getting paid for your food and fiber as you sell it to supply chains, but you're also going to see the impacts, both positive and negative, on the environment priced in to the way that you sell your commodities. And it's not just about carbon. Biodiversity is well and truly next. Carbon is in the position to be mandatorily reported on because of a task force for climate-related financial disclosures, or the TFCD. And it worked for over a decade to get a framework that brought all of the climate risk down into CO2e. Now they're trying to do the same for biodiversity, and you can see, hot on the heels of what people consider the success of the CO2e and the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, is the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures. And you can see first movers, European funds, now setting up biodiversity-only funds. And you can see that some of the claims of these are, we want no financial downside and systems change. We invest in biodiversity not only for impact, but because they see it as profitable. This is starting to happen. And locally here in Australia, we're seeing it, the Nature Repair Bill, which is basically another way of saying the Biodiversity Bill. And it's in relation to the existential threat of catastrophic biodiversity loss. What if we lost all the bees and we lost our link to breakfast and we had that sort of scenario? Well, we're pricing in the costs around biodiversities and species loss. We're also a signatory to the restoration decade. The UN restoration of decade is running now, and we're 4 years into it, or nearly 4 years into it, and we still haven't set targets in Australia. And Australia is a signatory to the 30% to nature by 2030 target, which, if you look at the amount of land currently under a protected covenant, that looks like we're going to need to expand the existing protection mechanisms, many-fold, or we'll be taking into account other land types, other land uses, and other land holders. And we're a signatory to the COP26 commitments, which is where we have settled on going live with mandatory reporting in 24-25. And as if like watching biodiversity looming on the back of carbon down isn't enough, we're actually looking at ESG. Now, if you thought the sort of gorillas in the market like McDonald's that I showed on the slide previously, when you're looking at ESG, you're looking at the big four, you're looking at the Bain and Co, you're looking at Moody's, you know, these are the organizations that determine the flows of capital, the ratings, the credit that large organizations receive. And they're very much interested in environment, social, and governance, or what they call ESG. So it can be quite overwhelming, and I don't blame farmers for why they want to stick their head in the sand, you know, and I guess that has been one of our first learnings, is that just with, you know, the fatigue that farmers have had with always being, you know, price takers, with paying, you know, retail for their inputs, getting paid wholesale for their outputs, and not seeing much movement in farm gate prices, and then the complexity of the carbon market. Many of them are just saying, I'm not going to participate. And then there are others who see the benefits of farmers' participation. And I think, you know, the key to that is that farmers are the only group who hold all the aces as we start to factor in climate and carbon dioxide. Every industry you care to think of, because it burns, builds, or transports, it's emitting, except for agriculture, where photosynthesis can actually sequester from the atmosphere carbon and put it into soils, trees, green leafy plants, or into food product or biomass. So photosynthesis is the tool, the only proven technology, if you will, that can sequester carbon, and farmers have it at their disposal. Farmers literally, and I mean like actually, legally, technically, financially, own the environment that everybody else is so concerned with. And as a result, farmers own the environmental opportunity. So as they're going to be measured on this carbon dioxide emissions, let me share with you what we've kind of learnt about the emerging carbon dioxide emissions market and how that plays into farmers. So in Australia, we deal with the Australian Carbon Credit Unit, and one carbon credit unit is the equivalent of 1 tonne of carbon dioxide. Now, what we've found is that there's sort of 2.5 schemes running in Australia to help us get to 43% net reduction by 2030 and a full net zero by 2050. And I'll talk to each of these schemes. The Emissions Reduction Fund and Climate Active are definitely schemes. And the half of a scheme is the safeguard mechanism and regulation, which the government uses to prime the other 2 schemes. So if we look at the ERF, what we're looking at here for agriculture is about 14.8 million carbon credits have been traded through the Emissions Reduction Fund. All these results are from the latest auction on the 6th of April. And you'll see, pardon me, the price here looks to be, you know, significantly higher, $36, than the price that you'll see that was paid for the last auction. That's because there's a different price on retirement versus a price on the futures. And so the futures for carbon contracts are trading at about twice and a bit the value of a retirement carbon credit. So the results of our carbon efforts to date as an Australian kind of community is that we've actually created a $2.7 billion industry across all auctions. You might have thought, given the amount of headlines that the carbon industry has been able to attract, particularly in the recent years, that it was a bigger you know, a pot of money than that, and that agriculture had a bigger play in that $2.7 billion. The other and the reason I count the two ERF and Climate Active as the two schemes that count in Australia is that they're the only ones that reduce our national greenhouse accounts. So Climate Active is an interesting thing. It's not part of the ERF. It's not even part of the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries. It's not even part of the energy portfolio. It's part of the industry portfolio. And as a result, it was sort of aimed not at farmers. It was aimed more at products and services and events, so that basically you could hold a carbon neutral Commonwealth Games in Melbourne or a carbon neutral Olympic Games in Brisbane. And so what we're seeing is a program, and one of only two, that farmers could enter into, which would count towards our national greenhouse gas emissions. And if they can show as farmers that they are net zero, and there have been two farmers to my knowledge, Christoph Burr and Robert McKenzie, who've been able to do this, then they can report their carbon emissions against the Climate Active standard, receive a Climate Active carbon neutral product branding. Most of the, apart from Robert and Christoph, who are the only two farmers that have done that from carbon on their own farms, most people get Climate Active by buying carbon dioxide equivalent from around the world, Brazilian wind projects, Indonesian rainforests, and then offsetting that carbon dioxide saved on those projects against the emissions that they're making here in Australia. And the Climate Active standard supports that. So if I'm a farmer and I want to, start to understand how to get into the carbon market, the first thing you'll kind of want to do is understand, well, what are my emissions on farm? What's my potential liability in terms of emissions? And you can use carbon estimation tools, and there are tons of them, and they're all wrong, but they're also all usable. So what they're useful for is having an idea, like broadly, of what your emissions are, so that you can look on farm at what your sequestration opportunities are. Now, you don't get down to specifics, and there's no need to get down to very, very specifics with your estimation, because you're going to get into those specifics with either Climate Active or with the ERF in order to generate your projects with them. So you look for something that's simple and free as a farmer. One such example is the Ag Steward program, which the Australian government has funded, which enables you to do a free carbon estimation of your farm. You will find that the MLA has a beef calculator tool. GRDC has one for grains. Most horticulture has one. So for most farmers, they could use their free industry-specific tool in order to understand their emissions. And then once they've found out what their emissions are, it could be 128 tons of carbon dioxide emissions a year, or it could be 10 times that, or it could be 100 times that. And you kind of need to know in order to understand what your opportunities are to sequester carbon and to achieve net zero. So what you're really looking at in terms of opportunity finders is using Look-See, which is a government tool. It's very broad. It can't be used in order to do an ERF project or a Climate Active project, but it can give you a certain idea based on the hectares of what the carbon sequestration opportunities are under different methods. You can talk to a consultant, somebody who's done it before. You can talk to a project developer, a carbon project developer, or as we'll talk about later, you can understand your opportunity within a landscape impact program. But the point of it is you're trying to find the sinks or the projects that will enable you to more than offset your emissions, to potentially be able to sell or earn income from the sequestration that farmers are uniquely able to do. So talked a bit about carbon. We've talked a bit about how there's this scope 3 emissions requirement that's coming, and supply chains is where this convergence matters. So supply chains are needing to report not just on the Trust for Nature, Task Force for Nature and climate related disclosures, but for international finance and reporting standards and for ESG risks, for animal welfare risks. Now, what we do is help our farmers report this and enable them to get better payment. So, for example, we're helping farmers to collect high quality data, certify, for example, that they are net zero, either off purchases of CO2e from external or from their own farms CO2e, so that they can then sell their wheat, their wool, their beef, their horticulture, and separately provide a net zero certification under the climate active standard to that supply chain, so that that supply chain can then buy the produce and buy the certificate at the price that's closely matching the market price for carbon at that time. And that enables that supply chain not to have the emissions of that farmer counted towards their emissions under the scope 3. So one of the things that we're working on to make this all possible is a grant. I think I'm going to get in trouble for this, but by the time people watch it, it should be fine. We actually got word we got the grant, but we're not meant to go public about it. But it's with a great cohort, the Australian Farm Institute, National Farmers Federation, Standards Australia, Regen Farmers Mutual, the Fulton's Marketing Group that represent McDonald's here in Australia, and GoSource, who the guys that wrote the white paper on the UN's verified credentials. And what we're helping farmers to do is collect data, initially using the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework data set, be able to then pass on how those farmers score in relation to the AASF, how the results of the AASF data relate through Standards Australia to other standards that operate in the marketplace, and having someone like Fulton's understand, well, if the AASF has collected 80% of the data that's needed for my responsible sourcing of beef, and I just need to add animal welfare and deforestation data over and above that, well, then that enables me to set up farmers to say, look, you've got your AASF score, you're 80% of the way to doing your responsible sourcing score. If you can do that, it will pre-qualify you to sell your beef into essentially the McDonald's supply chain. And so we're working on, as Regen Farmers Mutual, with farmers, with industry, to help farmers be able to collect, analyze, and share their data in a safe way. And it's really important that we work out how to do this, because there's a gap which is starting to become like a big problem in agriculture. It's not talked about enough. But if mandatory reporting on your scope 3 emissions is happening in 2024-25, and you are in a project for, regrowth or soil carbon or pretty much any of the ERF methods, you won't be generating your ACCUs for several years, 3 to 7 years, depending on the method. And so you might end up in a situation where farmers are actually short on carbon emissions in the first few years of mandatory reporting before being the farmers or the source that can actually sequester carbon into the long term. So farmers might find themselves needing to be buyers. They might find themselves short individually in order to, not receive access to market issues, or in order to receive price premiums. That might happen at an individual level. That will certainly be an issue for cooperatives of farmers around Australia, regardless of the industry that they're in, whether it's dairy, wheat, wool, beef, and it will become more and more of a problem for supply chains. So the benefit of having the mutual is that we can help our farmers buy and sell and bring forward their future carbon abatement, match it against the climate active standard, so they can get carbon neutral certified and offset internally their emissions with their sequestration and or purchases, and get their certification into the supply chain and get them paid for that. And that's a bit of a bold statement to make, because if you look around, the banks, their emissions for scope 3 are the sum of the farmers' emissions. The suppliers, their emissions are the sum of their supply sheds emissions. Government, their emissions are the sum of the farmers' emissions. So everybody wants the farmers' emissions. And what will be the default position for supply chains, because they're used to farmers having, the same farm gate percentage and doing more and more over time, is that farmers will absorb this price. Now, we don't think that farmers should absorb the price. We think everybody should share the price. And when farmers can demonstrate their net zero, well, then the supply chain and the consumer should be paying for the embedded carbon in that. And in order to do that, we think farmers need to lead the discussion. So I'll remind you again that it's farmers who own the environmental opportunity. They hold all of the aces. And over a 25-year life cycle of, say, a carbon project, to be short in the initial years because of the way that the market is set up doesn't mean farmers should give away the farm and 99% of their future ACCUs in order to be net zero in the first few years. So how can farmers collectivize? And that's where, supply chains meet landscape, and particularly landscape impact programs. These are designed to create collective, open transactions within a landscape. There's a pre-program phase where we help, farmers identify themselves as a potential group. Then they go through the startup phase and identify a project. They work together over a 20-week program and design a transaction that from the get-go is open. And what we mean by open is it's at a scale that, initial farmers can enter, but it enables farmers, neighbors in that landscape to join over time and add more to that transaction. And ultimately, it enables farmers to get rewarded for the good things that they do. Some of the tools we use in landscape impact programs are the circle of influence, seeing who farmers connect with both locally, environmentally, and through the farmer organizations that they own and work with. And we have some science around it. We give the working team roles, we engage with 10 pilot farmers, and we use the 4 returns framework. So this group of farmers on screen now are a bunch of the pilot 10 and the working team within the Traprock region of Far North Queensland. And what we are doing with them is creating it's called the Flourishing Fir Forest Farms and Families. And it's the Traprock Regenerative Agricultural Landscape. What they've found is that they have a massive amount of what is left of box gum grassy woodlands. Most of the western side of the Great Dividing Range has been cleared. And when we've cleared that, we've cleared habitat for things like koala, quoll, heaps of birds. And because the Traprock is so undulating and rocky, hard country, actually you couldn't get a bulldozer in there. So there's a lot of remnant patches of box gum grassy woodlands. And what the farmers in the Traprock have realized is that that's actually an asset for them to build upon. And if they can thin out unmanaged forests and regenerate cleared area and turn it into open box gum grassy woodlands, they have the opportunity of creating a biodiversity corridor throughout the Traprock, which extends the habitat and provides meaningful habitat for threatened ecological communities. We'll talk more about them in a second. Also coming online is 2 Tasmanian landscape impact programs centered each around an irrigation scheme. The first one in North Esk and the second one in the Scottsdale area. Then we have 6 landscape impact programs that are funded through the Ian Potter Foundation. as a consortium between Landcare Victoria, ANU Sustainable Farms, the Landscape Finance Lab, and ourselves as Regen Farmers Mutual. And the idea here is to fund and help 6 landscapes in Victoria go through the Landscape Impact Program, and for Landcare to work out, well, what is their business model in relation to these new environmental markets and how they work supporting their farmer members. The Landscape Impact Programs, we've seen, since these 9 others that are funded, that they're actually our path to market. They're what enables us in each Landscape Impact Program. We take through 10 pilot farmers, but we see that expanding to 100 farmers in each region, maybe more depending on the region. And if we do 100 of these Landscape Impact Programs between now and the end of 2028, we should reach 10,000 farmers, which is roughly about 10% of the farmers who earn more than 50,000 a year and less than 2 million a year from their agricultural production. So what are the sorts of benefits on the ground for farmers working in a landscape scale? This is me at the trap rock in the wool shed, raising the fact that we could do this Landscape Impact Program and identify something that they could do individually and collectively that would have a material environmental impact and would have the scale that enables them to access buyers who typically won't talk to individual farmers, who need a certain scale in order to satisfy the costs of a transaction. So we came up with the Trap Rock Landscape Regeneration Project, flourishing fur, feathers, farms, and forests. And as I mentioned, this is all based on this idea that the farmers observed that where they have open box gum grassy woodlands, and in the background, this photo of Andy Finlay and Andy Ferrier, you can see a 30-year-old stand of box gum grassy woodlands. It's relatively dense, but you can still see it's not impeding, animals from being able to graze. It's not competing for sunlight between the grasses and the trees. In fact, Andy Finlay puts his ewes in here for lambing, because this is because Trap Rock has notoriously poor soils, the trees are actually bringing up nutrients from deeper down and cycling that. So the forage and therefore the milk is better for the ewes at lambing time, and the lambs are getting stronger and higher survival rates. The trees also stop the hawks and the eagles from taking out the lambs. So there's a real regenerative agricultural principle running here, that it's good for the farm in terms of the farm and productive, but it's also good for biodiversity, because that open box gum grassy woodlands is home to so many threatened ecological threatened and endangered species. So the farmers in the Trap Rock really have to work out, and what we provide them within a Landscape Impact Program is real tools. So some of these tools are the Trap Rock tools. And so the first sort of thing, or one of the first things we work through with the farmers when they're trying to identify what carbon opportunities do I have on farm, is ruling in and out certain ERF methods. And what we found with farmers in the Trap Rock, they've got like 2 main options. Either they've got forested land over 20% cover and 2 meters tall, which means that they could go for avoided clearing, not to be confused with avoided deforestation, which is a dodgy method. Avoided clearing is a legit method. Or if it's unforested, less than 20% and less than 2 meters, they might have HIR or NFMR opportunities. Then we enable the farmers to understand, well, if I went with HIR or NFMR methods, that means that I'm going to put up a fence. I'm going to reduce grazing for 5 months of the first 5 years while the box gum grassy woodlands and the recruiting saplings actually establish. But after that period, I'm no longer dealing with cleared land, eagles, hawks, lower nutritional cycling. I'm actually getting a higher value pasture where I've got both productivity and biodiversity benefits. And so it's about creating a regenerative agricultural, meaning an economically profitable and environmentally profitable set of interventions. And of course, you're going to want to know, what makes box gum grassy woodlands. So we worked with our farmers to create, using the best of the science, a farmer sensible model that they can go out there, they can count the number of saplings, the diversity of grasses, and they can actually identify, do I have box gum grassy woodlands? Do I have derived native grasses? Or do I have like a cleared pasture that can be renovated and turned into box gum grassy woodlands that's open and has all these agricultural benefits? And then we help them to, understand their carbon estimation area, understand their biodiversity area, understand how the proximity of those biodiversity areas to their carbon areas and the connectivity to one another as neighbours helps extend the biodiversity corridor. Ultimately, our first 12 farmers connect Pikes Creek, a reserve, with Sundown National Park across 15,000 hectares of what was pre-European clearing, all box gum grassy woodlands, and of which today they have the right to clear. But instead of getting it cleared, we actually want to motivate and incentivize through biodiversity and carbon dollars farmers to maintain healthy, open box gum grassy woodlands. What we also learned, with the trap rock is that a lot of these environments can be low carbon, high biodiversity. And when you're in a low carbon environment, there's significant barriers just to the complexity and the costs of auditing, or what we call measurement, verification, and reporting. And so actually the mutual can step in, unlike any other sort of organization, being member owned, and allow those farmers to collectivize, and the mutual act as a proponent, all on their equal behalf, as a trusted entity that can represent them in market, just like we do with supply chains and just like we do with advice. By being the proponent, we can also even out the cash flow for our farmers, recognizing that in the first few years, the costs can be significant before they start to see accus returned, and that those might be better smoothed out for farmers so that they're financially rewarded from the first moment they join a transaction, and get increasing rewards over time as the maturity of their impact starts to be felt. One of the cool things, though, that we come out of a landscape impact program with is a participant information pack, which actually steps them through exactly what it is that they need to be doing. Now, also, you get collateral, which enables them to engage with buyers and other farmers in the region. And rather than tell you about that collateral and to give you a 2-minute break from my voice, I'm going to play Andy Ferrier's video for you.
I'm Andrew Ferrier. This is probably Mallow.
Wouldn't you know,
been here since 1992, and we've converted it from just raw merino sheep into organic lamb production. And in doing that, I've become really interested in biodiversity and the health of the landscape. I've now become interested in what Regen Farmers can offer us as a group and as a district. So if we've got, say, 8 properties in the pilot group that we're working with now, so they're like little stepping stones in the district. So we've got them and we'll map them and we'll put them together. But the idea is then to expand that out. Development of the benefit for the environment that we can do with that is just unbelievable. There's hotspots of these, biodiversity threatened species areas here. To try to get some connectivity is just going to be so important. So back in the early 1990s, we put together a group called the Trap Rock Wool Association. That was put together when the wool industry was falling apart. That group, Trap Rock Group as it's called now, is still in existence, and it's got over 60 members, active members in there, and it's what it's given the landholders is confidence to be part of a project like this. So as a group, we've been talking to SQL, they're the local NRM group, and we're dealing through Regen Farmers, and we've been looking for markets because we know we've got the product here, we've got a heap of product, but we need to be able to assess it. We need to be able to monitor it. We need to be able to verify what we've got, report on all that, and then sell it. Different ones here. These grasses. There's a little daisy. So yeah, that's just part of the assessment process. It's quite comprehensive, but it's what we're looking to do in the future. I'm Andrew Ferrier.
Thanks, Andy.
This is probably.
So additionally, they get the information pack, and in their local area is a Regen advisor. Now, the Regen advisors are independent consultants, usually ex-land care or NRM or independent agronomists who we've been able to train to use our tools and understand the infrastructure of the mutual. Now, when we're bringing on members one at a time, it's very hard for that to be an income stream. But when you bring on landscape impact programs, what you're doing is bringing that Regen advisor in with the other roles that co-design the transaction so that they can create an onboarding product that's suitable for farmers in that landscape and helps them enter into the open transaction. And of course, coming together as a group of farmers in a local area helps them to raise the funding. So that Trap Rock group that Andy talked about was able to go through the Landscape Impact Program, which is a six-figure program, because the Land Restoration Fund in Queensland saw the value in supporting them. And they saw the value in, leading in Australia around aggregated landscape impact programs. They're a Queensland-only fund that was looking at Queensland farmers. For themselves, they've only provided, even though they're called the Land Restoration Fund, Landscape Restoration Fund, they've never done an aggregated project with two or more farmers involved in the same carbon project. They do pay for biodiversity over and above the carbon, but they require carbon as the cornerstone, as the anchor of their project. And they open in rounds. So we've got till, I think, the 2nd of June to submit for our $10 million round with the LRF. And so we're right in the thick of submitting the first ever landscape impact program and landscape impact transaction that has flowed off the back of that program. Part of the benefit of coming together as a group is the reporting. So the Landscape Impact Program, where farmers are stakeholders that we run at Regen Farmers Mutual, sits inside a landscape that has other stakeholders, NRMs, land care, Indigenous landholders, Crown lands, national parks, state parks, urbanites who buy the food and live locally. And so the 4 returns framework looks at 4 returns. It has a 5-step program for the 3 types of zones: natural, shared, and economic zones. And we're basically creating within that broader landscape a farmer stakeholder, farmer incentivized transaction that anchors all the rest around it. Then those impacts in the broader community, whether they're inspirational, social capital, natural capital, or financial capital, can be measured in terms of those impacts. And we measure that the same way we do with the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework, through a farmer's data collection, through assessment, and through sharing, so that the data is compliant with the Farm Data Code version 2.0, so that the farmer has the rights to their data, the rights to remove access to the data, the rights to be rewarded for their data. And we're very proud of the fact that the Regen Farmers Mutual, through our Landscape Impact Program, have been able to meet with the Landscape Finance Lab. They are literally the guys, as in the founder of Landscape Finance Lab is Paul Chatterton, who worked at WWF and the Nature Conservancy and wrote the book called The 4 Returns Framework. And as a result of that work, we're starting to see, international attention from the likes of Rockefellers, Mercers, that biodiversity fund that I had up on screen earlier, looking at how in Australia we bring farmers together to do the landscape impact program and what they can do within the broader community. We're getting to the end of my slides, and I promise there'll be time for questions. The last part that we're working on is how do you get farmers through that funding hurdle, through that gap between when they're producing the carbon credits and when they're needing to be buyers. And so we recognize that this is coming soon, but what we've learned is that we need a group structure for the mutual. Our company limited by guarantee, of which our members belong, is a mutual, but we can see the need for a regen investment, which will invest in the farmer-owned projects, maybe up to 25% of the carbon that could be generated by a project could be lent to a farmer in order to pay for the fences, the tree guards, the opportunity cost of grazing, that we can measure and certify the outcomes, whether that's the 4 returns framework, whether that's the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework, whether that's the carbon neutral certification, whether that's the responsible beef sourcing requirements. Regen Digital can help those farmers collect that information. And then Regen Trading can allow farmers to aggregate their carbon, both on the buy and the sell side, and in the future, aggregate their biodiversity and ESG and other impacts through a single desk where we've got control and retain the value for members. And we want that investment to come into farmers from those who need the resulting carbon credits or biodiversity credits, as that enables us to have surety of supply when lending, have surety of a buyer at the end, and of course, make sure that we're selling to those organizations that our farmers feel most comfortable with. One of the first learnings that we've had in Regen Trading is, for example, that we need to have a pool that enables farmers to sell unrestricted to anybody who needs carbon, and a pool that might comply with the WWF carbon policy, which by necessity would take out all of the people in Australia under the safeguard mechanism. So there could be 2 prices based on where the farmer wants to sell their carbon, whether they want to sell it to somebody who's retiring that carbon, who is on the white list, or whether they're happy to sell that carbon to the highest bidder, which will probably come from coal, oil and gas, who are the highest emitters. And we appreciate that the fund has to have a mandate, and our mandate is that we help farmers to, generate value from themselves through these agricultural and climate markets starting to converge. And whether that's through landscape impact programs and or supply chains, we see that it's really important that farmers get a fair share, since it's them that's doing the work. It's their actions that are creating the photosynthetic process and creating that sequestration. Everybody else in the world is an emitter except for farmers, and it's time that farmers got rewarded for that. So I started off today saying I'd try and walk you through the fact that there was a convergence, what that looked like, how that was coming together through Scope 3. Tried to help you understand the lingo around the CO2E and the tools of the trade, how landscapes come into this, how actually being at landscape scale helps the individual farmer because it reduces their risk, decreases their costs and cuts the complexity. And it enables us, when we've got farmers at the kind of center of environmental good work within a landscape, that we can bring the broader community with us. We can bring our supply chains with us. We can bring our industries with us. And we can get to a scale where we can work with counterparties to fund these on-farm projects in a way that benefits the farmers. So I'm going to turn off the presentation at this point and ask you if you're still awake, still there. I appreciate that I talked at you for a good 45 minutes then. If anybody has any questions or would like to learn together, there's no such thing as a dumb question. I did try and move very quickly, so if you'd like me to recap anything, I certainly can. But the that is all the stuff that I can think of that we've kind of learned in the last 12 months since we've been open for members. And I'm happy to be an open book on behalf of the mutual and the members that we work for.
Andrew, Jane from CBH here. That was excellent. You guys just done so much incredible work in the time when I spoke to you first. So congratulations. Look, we have been looking at this for the CBH cooperative for some time. What do you think are the biggest hurdles in carbon project participation, or really anything to do with sustainability from a grower side? What would be some of the key themes in barriers to getting involved?
Oh, look, I think that costs and complexity and confusion. I've got this whole, I was sort of hoping to get it done for this, but I've been counting all the objections and the common, things that I'm hearing. And I guess I sum it up with, it feels unfair to farmers when they learn that they're going to be pinned for emissions, but nothing of what they've done up until now counts. And that whatever they start to do now in the formal markets might take years to yield if they're doing it on their own. And so there are a lot of them who are starting to go and talk to one another. Let's not participate in this madness and it will go away. My concern is that the madness won't go away. Instead, that supply chains and the world will change, and it will say, hey, you know what, farmers, you're just so hard to deal with. We're going to estimate all this stuff from space and send you the bill. And I think if that ends up happening and farmers aren't proactive, that's a real risk. But yeah, the biggest challenge, I think, is, fear and confusion and costs and unfairness up front. And then it's actually difficult. Like, I'll talk you through how we stumbled through the landscape impact program and the carbon method developments. So we're very fortunate to have Christoph Burr, who I referred to there as one of the few farmers that has done a climate active, carbon neutral and ERF project. He's quite a Renaissance man. He was an engineer by trade and worked at Baines and worked at McKinsey as a management consultant. So he has this unique brain where he went through the act for avoided carbon, for plantation, for soil carbon, for NFMR, and he ran on his own farm ERF projects, and he unpacked the 184 steps that it is required to go through the life cycle of a carbon project for avoided clearing, or the 250 for plantation. And he went through and unpacked that. There's almost no farmer I've met who would have those skills and interest alignment to do that except for Christoph. And so you just look at that as a barrier for project development is significant. Likewise, I think the solution, though, is you take, as we are, Christoph's great work and you digitize that into a spreadsheet at the moment, but later a software, and it becomes a sequential order of 184 steps with a couple of decision trees. And you need to go and references some GIS software, but you can actually create project management software to help farmers. We're in the process of trying to do that with Christoph. But, if we didn't have a Christoph in the world, it's just bloody hard work. One of our friends, Sam, said it's almost like the last government who didn't believe in climate change also created an ERF that wasn't built for mass adoption, And so I would say costs, confusion, efficiency, getting into projects, and then just the sheer complexity of the project development once you've decided to get into it. Those are the two barriers that I see, Jane. Yeah.
Thank you. Very, very well answered. Cheers.
Any other questions?
I've got a quick question, Wardy,
Yeah.
and it's more of a technical one, and it was only one when I picked up before that you mentioned the avoided clearing methodology versus avoided deforestation, which I have heard was not the greatest methodology. But can you just, in a nutshell, if it's possible, just say why avoided clearing, for example, is better in your
Yeah. So avoided deforestation means you've already planted a forest at some point, and then you've kind of seen that the price for wood is no good, and so you've decided not to cut down your eucalypt forest or whatever. Avoided clearing, however, is still native vegetation that has regrown and been cleared twice before in history, and it's now regrown for a third time. And instead of clearing it, which is your legal right, and you've done twice before historically, you're avoiding that clearing, and you're instead going to manage it to an open box gum grassy woodlands, in their case, in the trap rock. And as a result, they're awarded carbon credits. Now, the funny thing is, because you're selling an avoided clearing cycle, it fits within, you've got to show 2 previous cycles that would result in you needing to avoid clearing within a 3-year kind of window. So at any given time, farmers have to be able to go back into history, sometimes back into the 1960s, to show photographic evidence, which is hard, right? Certainly no satellites up there, of what was cleared and what wasn't cleared. It's a much harder barrier than avoided deforestation, which was basically, we have a plantation forest, we've decided not to chop it down, pay us for that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, maybe that was why I hadn't heard of it as much, if it's the avoided clearing one. Yeah, okay. Thank you. And also thank you, sorry, I'm going to jump in. Thanks for explaining that trap rock group stuff so well. I had watched a few of the videos on YouTube that were on there, and being not far from that area and familiar with it to an extent, but I think you just explained it really well. So yeah, I think that's a really exciting project.
I love it. I love that area. I worry if we had to do 100 landscapes between now and 2028, how I could fall in love with 100 landscapes. It's a bit of a problem. You know.
No, it is a pretty special part of the world. I was driving through there on the weekend, actually, and trying to explain to my husband what the project was about. So yeah.
Any other questions? Babe, I might just check on if there are any in the chat. So, Anne Louise, is there carbon soil testing regime involved when doing groups of farmers? Is the wildlife corridor back to national parks planned? And do you want me to answer individually for those questions? Because they seem to be, yeah. If we do a landscape impact program, we don't come in with an idea of what the intervention is. There's like this stock taking of an emergent process where the farmers in the pilot tent and the working group, in consultation with the NRM goals, etc., determine what that opportunity or intervention might be. And so if it was improving soil organic matter, and therefore soil carbon might be a product out the back of that, then you definitely need to test in that regime to establish a baseline, and you're reporting over that over time. In the trap rock, it's certainly it's just such variable rainfall. They can go from 300 mils to 900 mils. It's shit house soil. It's called trap rock. You break steel augers all the time in that area. Soil carbon is not a thing for them, but it might be in a different landscape. We're looking at in Tasmania, potentially there's large amounts of food industry there, and food waste, and biochar is also locally around that Launceston area of real interest. So we know that there's some farmers there who are producing food waste that's turned into biochar that might be applied to their soil and improve any soil carbon opportunity that they've got. I quite like those sorts of projects as well. So we're not for or against soil carbon, but as of now, it's not a requirement. When doing groups of farmers in the wildlife corridor back to the national parks. So when we sit with the farmers in the first public session and the 10 pilot farmers have got their sort of initial environmental farm assessment, we print out giant big maps and we're looking in context of where are the boundaries, what sort of corridor does it make, what are the state and crown and other lands that are around. And if we can identify, the start of a corridor or a stepping stone or an aggregation, then we start looking at that. Land purchase offsets as a farmer.
I'll explain that one.
Yeah, please.
If you want. I'm a farmer, but I also work for a renewable company. And part of our consent is a requirement to do offsets. But these offsets are fundamentally farms bought and locked up. There's no livestock grazing allowed. So in the past, which the company I work for is trying to avoid, they end up places, a haven for feral pigs, foxes. They tend to get overrun. If they get woody weeds, then you lose the light on the ground, so you lose your grasses, which are usually the greatest source of carbon sequestration anyway. So I don't think the governments have got their head around locking up countries, not always the best solution. Sometimes it does need some form of grazing, also just for fire reduction risk. You can have a lovely offset area, you get a hot fire in there, it's done. It won't come back readily. But as I said, with my farmer hat on, I hate that locked up idea. I've seen in Queensland where it's just set country backwards.
We would agree actively managed and properly managed landscapes is the ideal. And the nature of what we're going to submit to the LRF in Trap Rock is that, across the area that was pre-clearing and that farmers have the right to clear, there'll be forested area that we want them to protect, but we're not protecting it under covenant. We're protecting it under an active management agreement. And by that, we're meaning the farmer has to control feral animals and feral weeds, and there's no grazing restrictions because it's already forested. But we're encouraging them to thin trees, not more than 10% in a year, and always maintaining greater than 20% coverage, so that they get a diversity of species and that light penetrating through. Now, how they go about thinning that, there's fire, there's chemical, there's, physical removal, and each of them have costs and benefits associated with it. So you actually have to price the incentive so that you're not introducing, we've just protected this land and we're thinning every 10% of the trees every year with a herbicide. That's not going to lead to the outcome. So you got to do it right.
But the flip side, you're saying you've got a forested area and you're not going to clear it because it's not commercially viable or whatever. You also need not only a diversity of species, but you need a diversity of age structure.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's often missed at a government level too.
Absolutely. The ERF is legislation, right? So they're blind, even if the clean energy regulator staff are willing and, flexible, they can't do what's in there. And so when we measure everything using the full CAM methodology, and it predetermines what the carbon output for any given plot of land is, then it encourages, maximization of that through the plantation of monoculture kind of eucalypt species. And instead of getting that local endemic species, of varying shrubs and trees and and kind of matching it off against local seed collection and doing it through time, we kind of have big efforts to plant monocultures of trees, which of course the roos and the deers and everybody else comes after. So we've got to think, I think, as advisors to farmers, get them, even though they're used to produce something in a year, sell it in a year, get paid in a year. Carbon markets are 25-year contracts, and we've got to get them thinking in the longer term about the landscape as a landscape, not just on their farm, but, you know, collectively as well. And kind of broaden your view of, it's not about getting carbon today, it's about carbon in 5 years, sort of thing. Molly, you're off camera or on camera. Have you got a question? No.
No, just being visible.
I've got a question. Gavin Tinning, what are you playing with, man? Syringes and liquid bottles?
Thank you for asking.
Andrew, it's Bruce. I've got a question just on bearing in mind what you said about at the start about, you know, having to, with the increase in new membership, being able to, you know, cater for that demand at the moment, and the focus on the landscape area, you know, propositions. Yeah. Are there still opportunities for individual farmers who through the mutual?
Yes-ish. So we've already taken on a heap of individual farmers. We want to be able to open membership to all farmers at like an education level, but then we don't want to introduce digital twins and landscape impact programs randomly. We want them to come on together at a certain scale. So there'll be opportunity for education and events for individual members, but until there's a landscape impact program in their region, and they can help us to create a group and catalyze that and get it funded. But unless there's a landscape impact program, we're not really spinning up new digital twins and making customership broadly available, but membership is widely available. Yeah.
Thanks.
Pip, your hands up.
Yeah, similarly, I guess follows on from Bruce's question. What are the opportunities for landscape scale projects similar to the Traprock or the Tassie groups going forward? And how, so I'm a farmer in Queensland, but I work with New South Wales and NRM. And so if there are opportunities, how can we make that happen?
Yes, so the pre-program phase, what we try and find is a group of 10 farmers that would be willing to get a free digital twin and an environmental farm assessment, their carbon emissions, and report back to a group of 5 on the working team. That group of 5 on the working team consists of different roles. So a business manager, a communication manager, an agronomist, a cat herder, which gets the right people in the right place at the right time, and then a farmer avatar. So those 5 get paid over the 20 weeks for 4 hours a week, $50 an hour. And they have a budget of about 30,000 for marketing, collateral, and expert advice. So it might be on hydrology or biodiversity or a particular threatened species or whatever. So the costs of the landscape impact program for labour and experts is around 50,000. We charge as Regen Farmers Mutual 50,000 for our piece as well, so that we can keep the lights on and afford to have, you know, somebody facilitate the programs. So the biggest barrier for most groups is coming up with that 100,000. So state governments and philanthropic organisations have been the 2 sources of money to date. So the LRF in Queensland, we're doing an application with PIPAP, the Primary Industries Production and Abatement Program, where we're trying to do 4 landscape impacts in New South Wales, Northern Rivers, Upper Clarence, Southern Highlands, and Western Murray Land Improvement Group. And for them, you know, we could potentially get $2 million from New South Wales government for running the landscape impact program, setting up the pilot sites, registering the project as the proponent, and then help the farmers to get committed funding for the plants, the tree guards, the fences, etc., of up to $10 million. So these landscape impact programs, if you can find 100 grand and the necessary pilot farmers and the 5 people in the working group, if you had that today, you could start tomorrow, but it usually takes a community time to get to that. And so I spend a lot of time on Zooms, or love going into a wool shed like the Trap Rock group or the North Esk irrigation scheme. And you go and you talk to 60 of them and you say, this is what we broadly want to do. And you will find 10 that are willing to be the pilot farmers. And out of that, you'll find 3 or 4 that are willing to be part of that 5-person team. But it typically does take somebody to sell you and tell you on how, you know, what we do individually doesn't have the materiality that what we do collectively does in the landscape. Like if you want to affect hydrology, you have to have surface area of the catchment. If you want to affect threatened species, you've got to have the habitat range for them to bloody live in. You know, so what an individual farmer can do is actually limited. Yeah.
And do those farmers ideally need to be connected in the landscape, or just live in the same landscape area, I guess?
Oh, they don't have to be connected. We look at a landscape generally as like the Trap Rock is that sort of hilly before you get to Inglewood, Texas, and it starts to flatten out, right? We've defined it as south of the Cunningham to the New South Wales, Queensland border, west of Stanthorpe to basically Inglewood. And so that whole area would be able to join the Trap Rock because it's similar in ecology, it's similar in carbon, it's similar in biodiversity. But once you start moving into that north or west or east of that, you're into a different landscape where a different set of transaction opportunities, stacking carbon and biodiversity and native species and community impacts, it would be better for that to be in a different environment. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions? I've got some in the chat. So Philip Browning, so what data do farmers have that no one else has in all of this? Oh, Philip, thank you. So everybody thinks that they can, like there's this bloody venture capital inspired idea that technology can solve everything and that the factory has no roof. So don't worry, farmers, we'll just see what you need to be doing, tell you, or see what you're doing, measure the value or impact of that, and then, you know, Robert's your father's brother. But I argue that you can't see much from space. So you can see that something went green, but you don't know whether that went green because of urea and the carbon emissions associated with that, or whether it went green because of a biodynamic fertilizer in a cow horn prepared in moonlight. You know, you also don't know what the margins of each of those practices were from a cost perspective or from a sales unit when you go to sell the biodynamic whatever turned green or the urea whatever turned green. Now, if what turned green fed an animal, you can't tell the genetics of that. You can't tell whether it's Wagyu or bloody leather on with a pulse, right? So I would argue that you can't see much of value. You can't see practices. You can't see genetics. You can't see margins from space, right? And that is all the information that the farmer has through their practices, through their day-to-day activities, that if we're blind to in our supply chains, means we don't really understand what's going on in terms of carbon or ecology or biodiversity or habitat health or hydrology on a farm. So that's the sort of data I want to see farmers own and get rewarded for, because it's the high value stuff you can't see from space. Jane, inserting versus offsetting creation, is there interest from the supply chain to receive insets from farms versus transfer of offsets. Yeah, I think there's the opportunity, like, first of all, a farmer, I reckon, should look after their own business. So making sure they're net zero through their own plantations, improve soil fertility, whatever ERF methods are appropriate to them. Then I think it's only right that they should look after the people that they do business with. Now, that might be local industry that needs to look after itself, but supplies jobs and, supplies teachers to the school that their children go to. And it might also be their supply chain, who, if they're selling beef, wheat, wool, whatever, too, might also need insets in order to be able to meet the cost of turning on lights or transporting hamburger patties or whatever they're doing. And then once you've looked after yourself and your surrounding businesses, then be aware you've got all these polluters in coal, oil and gas who have, through the safeguard mechanism and social license, a requirement to buy carbon. So if you look after yourself and look after your nearest and dearest next, then those that still have to buy are going to be paying, much more for it. So if you sell today to the offset market, to the coal, oil and gas, they're getting it at a pretty good price relative to what either your local industry, your supply chain, or you might need later on down the track. So insetting, I think, is very good for farmers to do. They will mostly do it, I think, through climate active certified net zero, which means that literally the farmer needs to get 2 checks when they sell the wheat, the wool, the beef or whatever, one for what it is and one for the certificate, which might say 1,000 accus were offset. Then I want to see that certificate cost that supply chain 1,000 times the spot price for carbon at that point, and the farmer get paid for both what they've produced and the carbon that they've sequestered. Whereas what supply chains are going to want to do is, not pay the farmer for the carbon at all, and only pay for the wheat, what they currently pay. Gavin, I'm finalising water samples, dissolved oxygen for a local Richmond River quality project. Awesome. Thank you for explaining that. I wasn't sure whether you were like Walter White or something else more sinister. Anybody else with a question? Otherwise, you might have earned yourself an early mark.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yep.
You're kind of describing earlier how there's a danger of being overwhelmed, and we've been bossed around so many times for so many years by all these other stakeholders, and I've had enough and push off. From what you've been working on, who do you think is coming through as the friends or enablers of farmers? Are things you kind of see change in that space? So if I give the example of like France, it's municipalities because it's to do with hydration and water catchment areas, or in England, it's again local councils around pollination and hedgerows. Australia, from your perspective, who are the players that can kind of create a movement or change that's helping farmers that might be different to 5 or 10 years ago?
I think farmers are lucky in a way that they usually already belong to groups. So sometimes they're groups of practice, organic, biodynamic, holistic, sometimes they're groups by industry, cattlemen, sheep farmers, wool growers. Land care in Australia has a pretty rich history. Industry bodies, they're levy funded, and so they should be on the farmers' side, but often I find that they're sometimes more aligned to the supply chains than to the actual farmers. Cooperatives in Australia, where they still exist. And then the big emerging light, the one that I hold most hope for, actually the NRM regions. Now, nationally, there's 54 NRMs. In Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, they're all called different things. In Queensland, they're independent bodies like Healthy Land and Water. Southern Queensland Landscapes, Burnett Mary Regional Group, and they look after farmers in their area. They're really proactive. They've got huge amounts of scientific work. They want to fill in the gaps where the market has failed. They've got really great attitudes. In New South Wales, those NRMs are housed within the LLS, the Department of Land and Local Services. In Victoria, the NRMs are housed within the Catchment Management Authorities, the CMAs. And there's a couple, 3 or 4 down in Tasmania and Western Australia. One NRM for the Northern Territory seems a little large, poor buggers. But yeah, I reckon the NRMs, because, you know, they've already been managing natural resources at a landscape scale and thinking about these problems from a biosecurity, from a intergenerational, from a hydrology, from a biodiversity perspective. I actually think NRMs are a huge assistant to farmer because they live in that context, in that landscape, but they're not the farmers. They can also play a role within the transaction of being a third-party auditor that gives certifier that gives investors confidence and is independent from the farmers, but also that the farmers know are credible and you know, from within the same region. So, Pip, your hand's up again.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to agree with what you're saying there. I work day job in a regional group with New South Wales with Local Land Services. I sit on a board for a Queensland one, and in both bases, there's really movement as to how our groups can support farmers in this space. So it's definitely a work in progress, but it's something that's really important to in both Queensland and New South Wales, and I dare say all the other states as well.
Anne, are you asking a question or saying
Yeah, more a comment in this field. I've successfully received several grants on a pest management, weed management level for a group of farmers where we used to live. One issue I do have with New South Wales in particular, there will be funding and grant programs, and just as success is being proved, the State Treasury will yank that funding and change it to something else. And so just as you're starting to see runs on the board and success, the rug's pulled out from under you as a group. That's the first issue. The second issue too, now in New South Wales, you effectively have to be part of an incorporated body to get those larger grants. The one I got, we were probably the last round that didn't need to incorporate. We now have incorporated. There's 51 land holders in a pest management group, but we still struggle to secure funding for big things.
I hear this from land cares, NRMs, that it's a constant cycle of grant writing and you know, if you've been there long enough, you're like, oh shit, I remember this grant coming out 12 years ago or 3 governments ago. And you're like, I think it might still be in my filing cabinet. So I think there is a problem with the way that these things have been structurally set up, whether it's state or federal funded, with the grant cycle. But there's another thing, that these environmental markets weren't here before. They're 25-year long dated contracts to go into carbon market, and biodiversity is similar. So it stands as a new source of revenue that isn't tied to the whims of new grant cycles or changes of government. So that might be a way for a breakage in the historical kind of grant cycle malarkey. It might not, but yeah.
I'm not put in the sense, my local land services, the real focus at the moment is the Regen honeyeater. It's not looking at an ecosystem so much as we'll fence off where we think it can live. We don't know if it's there or not. And we'll pay some stewardship funding. But to me, that's a very narrow way of thinking. It should be, find the trees are there. Is the bird there? If it's not, can we release it there? what are the issues if we release it there? Because they are releasing some that have been bred in captivity now in this region. But it's still very narrow focus, and it's all about honey regenerator at the moment. And I'm sure in another LLS it'll all be about a wombat or all about a koala, not a ecological area and what it can support.
Yeah, we love our furry creatures, koalas and quolls and pretty birds more than we love our other ugly endangered species. I don't know if I can solve that, but I agree with everything you said. Yeah. I've just noted it's gone 2:00. I appreciate everybody taking an hour and a half out of their time to listen to us share what we've learned. I hope there's some value in there for you guys. We will continue to be an open book. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much.